Good evening. I'm David Corey, Director of Baylor in Washington, D.C. Thank you for tuning in. Baylor in Washington educates students for a special kind of leadership. We try to show what leadership looks like when driven by Christian conviction. In fact, that's our mission, and it's central to the mission of Baylor University as well. So it seemed natural during this time of crisis to focus on leadership as a theme. We want to know what it's like for the leaders of large-scale Christian organizations to respond to this pandemic. What are the challenges? What virtues and skills are being called upon? Those questions are hard enough, but there are even harder questions, let's be honest. What's the future for large Christian organizations? To what extent are we competing with each other for survival? We don't want to shy away from these questions. In fact, we've assembled a group of co-sponsors and participants especially well-suited to dig deep into them. This event is co-sponsored by Christianity Today, an organization which since 1956 has been spotlighting the way people can live gospel lives for the strengthening of church and society. We're also co-sponsored by CCCU, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which comprises more than 180 Christian institutions around the world. I want to thank both these co-sponsors right now. Our speakers this evening will be Linda Livingstone, President of Baylor University, and Timothy Dalrymple, President and CEO of Christianity Today. Their full bios are available on the Baylor in Washington website, so let me just briefly say that Linda is the 15th president of Baylor University, having held previous administrative positions at Pepperdine and George Washington University. Her teaching and research focused precisely on management, on organizational behavior, leadership, and creativity. So she's the perfect person to address the questions we want to explore here tonight. Timothy Dalrymple became president and CEO of Christianity Today in 2019. He holds degrees from Stanford and Princeton, and he did a PhD at Harvard in the area of modern Western religious thought. Tim has served in youth ministry, prison chaplaincy, and in ministry with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. He's also served as vice president and business development for the well-known website Patheos. To lead and moderate the conversation, we've called on our friend John Inazu, the Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. John's most recent book, edited with Tim Keller, is called Uncommon Ground: Living Faithfully in a World of Difference, and it was actually released just last week and addresses the challenges that Christian leaders face in contemporary pluralistic societies. Again, the full bios of all three participants are available on the Baylor in Washington website, so please have a look if you're interested. John, thank you for bringing your expertise to bear on our conversation this evening. Linda and Tim, thank you for your willingness to tackle some hard questions with us. We're excited to have all three of you here. I'll hand it over to John now to get us started.
Great, thanks so much, David, and Linda and Tim. It's great and a privilege to be with you, and to all of you who are joining in, who, like me, probably have Zoom fatigue. Thanks for being here for the bonus round, and we will make it hopefully interesting and lively. We're going to have a discussion among the panelists here until about 8 p.m. Central Time, and then we'll turn it over to you all to ask questions. You can use the chat function on Zoom to pose questions, and there will be a behind-the-scenes team sort of sending those questions to me as well, and we'll get to those around 8 p.m. Central Time, and we'll be sure to start promptly toward the questions around 8. Let me start though, Linda and Tim, just by inviting you to reflect a bit, maybe narratively, on the past few extraordinary weeks. We have seen challenges across all sectors, across all institutions, in all kinds of ways. And I'd be interested in having each of you share with our audience what some of those challenges have been, how you've responded to them as leaders of institutions, and what has surprised you, and what's worked well, and some of the ongoing challenges. Linda, do you want to start?
Sure. No, I appreciate that, John. And it's great to be here with you and Tim and have this opportunity this evening. Well, I would have to say that the last month or so, month and a half, has been probably the most unique and interesting and challenging of my entire professional and academic career. And, you know, when you think about the challenges we faced, kind of on a very high level, we had to make, particularly as we were kind of in mid-March or so, really difficult decisions in a really short period of time with very little information. And you just, in an academic setting, you usually have more time to reflect on things and talk about things and get input. And we just didn't have that luxury as the pandemic became more serious and we had to make decisions about what to do with our students and our faculty and staff. And then I think there's another set of issues and questions that we've had to deal with that really have to do with our people. This has been really hard on people. Some people have health issues. We had a lot of people experience a lot of grief on our campus. Our seniors are not on campus for their senior semester and their graduation. We have music students that didn't get to do their senior recitals like they wanted to. We have student athletes that didn't get to finish their season. We had a couple of teams that were very likely potentially going to win a national championship and had to miss that opportunity. So we've had to work, how do we work with people, faculty, staff, and students that are grieving the loss of what this spring semester would have meant for them? And then I think now as we look ahead, we're going to have to make some really difficult and critical strategic decisions as we go into the fall, again, with very little good information or not the information you would like to have, uncertain information. And so just the uncertainty that goes with all of this poses some really interesting challenges and I think opportunities for us in leadership positions.
Tim, how about you?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I think because I want this to be really encouraging to everybody who's listening, I just want to start by saying that this is a topic about which I'm sure I have just as much to learn as anybody else who may be listening. And so I've had some opportunity to reflect on leadership and what it means to exercise leadership, going back to my athletic career and then within academia and within a more entrepreneurial space with my own business before coming here. But I am absolutely positive that I fail to live up to my own ideals every single day, and absolutely positive that I have just as much to learn from people like Linda and John. So I'm excited to learn from both of you and excited to be a part of this conversation. It's a conversation I need as much as anybody. Now for us, you know, the media landscape was already an exceptionally tricky landscape to navigate. And this is true of higher education as well. In our case, at the moment, there is, on the one hand, greater demand than ever before for the kind of thing that we provide, for trustworthy information, for biblical wisdom, for inspiring storytelling, and so forth. And yet, on the other hand, there is a real constriction of the resources that allow us to meet that demand. So just to be, you know, transparent with others out there who may be seeing real hits to their revenue. I mean, for us, it's across the board, right? And there are many media organizations that are shutting their doors. There are others that are making significant cuts. Now, Christianity Today, we're fortunate to be in a strong position, and my predecessors wisely managed the ministry, and so we're not facing an existential threat. But there's no question that all of our significant revenue streams are at risk. And so that's because advertisers are no longer advertising. That's because people are less likely to purchase new subscriptions or new products in the midst of economic uncertainty. And people are less likely to make donations, right? There's greater demand for donations than ever, and people, I think, are understandably more inclined to give to what seem like more pressing, more immediate needs. So that is certainly the case. At the same time, and I'll just mention this briefly because I assume we'll get into it further later. At the same time, I think this kind of shifting landscape has opened up really enormous opportunities, and we're seeing our content is reaching audiences that we have not reached at the very least for a long time. Younger audiences, more diverse audiences, more global audiences. And Christianity Today had already been in the process of really pressing dramatically in the direction of a more global footprint and interconnecting the global body of Christ. And this is a moment when I think we really see that coming to fruition, because the American church can learn from the Singaporean church, from the Italian church, from churches in Korea and so forth, right? This is an opportunity to pool the collective wisdom of the body of Christ and to catalyze action and respond as a global body of Christ in a way that I think is pretty unique.
What are some of the, Linda, what are some of the opportunities that you see in the current moment? I mean, we'll spend a fair amount of time probably talking about the challenges, but I want to sort of echo Tim's point that we do want this to be encouraging as well as challenging. So how about some of the opportunities that you might see on the horizon?
Well, I think anytime you're faced with a really challenging situation, you learn from that. And so I think absolutely, both as leaders in our organizations and the people in our organizations are going to learn and grow and actually learn how to adapt and change probably more quickly and more significantly than they maybe even thought that they could. I think that particularly in higher education, I mean, Tim was talking about how the media industry has been, had a lot of change and a lot of issues they've had to deal with. Education is the same way, and there's been a lot of questioning about the models in education and the way we learn and teach and our business models. And frankly, we're being forced right now to really look deeply at what we do, how we do it, why we do what we do, and think about different ways that we might do it because we're being forced to. But I think that because of that, on the other side of this, we will learn some things that will make us better. We will use technology differently in our environment, both in terms of the administrative side as well as the teaching and learning side, because of having gone through this, because we have so many more people that understand how to use technology in important and significant ways to enrich the learning environment, whether it's online or whether it's face-to-face. We're learning how to care for people in different ways. I think, one of the things in Christian community, we oftentimes think about Christian community being physically together with each other, if that's in our church, our Bible study, our school communities, and we're having to learn how to do community when we're physically distant from one another, and how to use technology to do that, and how to care for people when we can't be with them. And so I think it will make us much better at caring for those that we're not as close to all the time, and being more thoughtful about how we do that. And then, I think that in terms of our institutions, we will be more efficient, more thoughtful about how we're allocating and using our resources, and ensuring that the resources we have are really truly going to their highest and best purpose, and to truly support the core mission of the institution, because we're really having to think about that now. What are we doing that maybe we don't have to do, we could do differently, we could be more efficient at, but yet still allows us to drive our core mission really deeply. And then I think the final thing I would say is I do also think when we're in these difficult times as Christians, as people of faith, you do really kind of re-ground yourself in the foundations of that faith, and it gives you a strength and a foundation with which to deal with these challenges that, frankly, folks that do not have that foundation, I think, find it more challenging. So I think it does give us an opportunity to re-ground ourselves in our values, in the biblical principles that are critical to us as we lead and work. And that will absolutely be positive for us as we go forward.
Your comments about the upside of online connection resonated with me. I just finished teaching my classes yesterday after, the urgent and unexpected switch to Zoom that we all made. And I've been thinking a lot about how you hold in tension or together gratitude and lament. And so I'm grateful for this technology, and I'm grateful for the ways that I was able to continue to connect with students. And yet I really miss teaching in person. And this was sort of evident to me that there's not a good substitute for this. And when I connect with friends on Zoom, it's a great technology, and yet I really miss seeing people in person. So as we might anticipate what is to come, while we are still grateful for what we can do now. I want to turn, though, to something that Tim mentioned a while ago, and be a little more explicit with both of you about the ways in which this current crisis is emerging within institutional challenges that already existed. really across institutions. I mean, Yuval Levin has written very well about the challenge and the crisis to institutions writ large, and how there's a lack of trust of institutions, especially in younger generations. And then for each of you in your own vocational lanes, higher education and the media have had their own sets of challenges that have been going on for years, not weeks here. And so I wonder if you could talk a bit more about either challenges that have been highlighted in the current crisis, or perhaps new perspectives you've had about some of those challenges. I'm more familiar with higher education than the media, but the modern research university has become essentially a complicated conglomerate business with lots of different constituencies and lots of different business purposes, some of them which seem in tension with sort of the core mission of educating students and those sorts of things. So how do you hold in tension perhaps different missions and different purposes? And I could say the same thing for CT as you're doing the delivery of news and the commentary of culture and more entertainment focused strands of that. How do you hold together your different missional purposes? What are some of the challenges that have emerged to those purposes long preceding COVID? And what has COVID revealed about those challenges?
John, first, I want to follow up on your comment, and then I'll address the question that you just posed. So I resonate deeply with what you said about the ache and the yearning for incarnate human connection, for meaningful community, and I think for higher education institutions, emphasizing the deep importance and the formative importance of that kind of community is very important, because that's a part of the contrast, or a part of what's distinctive over against merely online learning. At the same time, I mean, it is so striking, isn't it, that we are today blessing many of the technologies that 3 months ago we were cursing. And there are social media technologies, multimedia communication technologies that I think we really felt like those were driving us apart. And yet at the moment, they're part of what is holding us together. And I think there's something to be learned there about being grateful for the creative capacities that God has given us to develop tools like this. And it is presently, I would say, that the churches, the institutions that were already leaning in the direction of finding creative utilizations of technology that were best positioned to respond within this moment. Now, to your question, I think it's true that the coronavirus pandemic has only accelerated certain changes that were already underway. And for us, for instance, there's just a strong imperative to diversify revenue streams. And both online and print advertising had been in a nosedive for quite some time, as most of that is moving over to properties owned by Google and Facebook. And so for an organization like mine, it's really critical that we are building deep, enduring relationships with people that engage with us. And that we are not merely dependent on advertising, but on other things, product sales, on subscriptions, on fundraising, and just making a case that we are a really meaningful part of the kingdom of God. And I think that that's something that I would emphasize and just kind of land on this point, that as we think about our institutions, it's important to think about leadership. I totally understand that. I worry sometimes that we overemphasize leadership. There's a whole cottage industry within the evangelical world on leadership content. And there's a sense in which that can be kind of puffing ourselves up, I think. And we don't often talk enough about what it means to be an excellent follower. And I think sometimes if we get in the mindset of just thinking about the preservation of our institutions, we're missing our picture in the broader kingdom of God. So Christianity Today, for instance, doesn't exist to serve Christianity Today, right? It doesn't exist to maintain a certain payroll. It exists to serve the kingdom of God. And sometimes we can do that best by being a leader and forging into areas that others have not. Other times, maybe we need to be the first follower. And Derek Sivers has a great video, it's a TED video, about the importance of the first follower. that until the leader has a first follower, the leader is just a lone nut, right? Once you have someone who is actually following you, that's when you actually become a leader. And then the other followers follow after that first follower. And so there may be ways in this moment in which we're not really meant to compete, but ways in which we are meant to band together and find organizations that are doing excellent work and come behind those and think a little bit less of our own institutional needs and a little bit more about the needs of the kingdom.
You know, John, in response to your question, some of the challenges higher education was facing before and how are they accentuated or magnified in this? I mean, there was already a lot of speculation that a lot of smaller colleges and universities might not make it for the next 5-10 years before the pandemic even started. And so I think there is certainly some reality to really some of the financial challenges some institutions were already facing being magnified during this and make it even more challenging for them to deal with that. You know, but when you have challenges, you can also come up with more creative solutions. And so it does provide opportunities for people to think differently about how they did their work and how to be creative. I think one of the other things in higher education, there's been a lot of criticism and discussion about, is higher education actually worth it? And is the value of higher education what it used to be, particularly for the cost and the debt that students have and so on? And those are very good and legitimate questions and ones that we have to take very seriously in the world that we live in, particularly if we're committed to educating, you know, a broad base of diverse students and giving them opportunities to have high quality education. But I do think one of the things out of this pandemic, science is really important in this pandemic. Understanding the virus, understanding cures for it, understanding ways to prevent it. And so I do think that some of the criticism of higher education, this may be an opportunity for higher education to have a role in some of these solutions through the great research that goes on, the scholarly activity that will actually help people understand on a different level why higher education matters, why the research that we do at our institutions matters, why it matters that we're educating students the way that we are. And then I think the other piece of it is, you know, there's been a lot of people speculating that eventually we would just move to online education, and why do we even need campuses and residence halls and physical buildings and such. And while I think we're learning a lot from this and we will have a lot of value from what we've gained from learning how to use technology, I think it has also emphasized, as both of you have said so well, the deep importance in human contact on a personal level. And I would argue particularly for undergraduate students who need that social contact, that ability to move away from home and grow and develop socially, professionally, academically, spiritually, in an environment where there's people around them that care about them, love them, or helping walk with them through really some of the challenging growth times in your life. And that experience in a residential setting for undergraduates is critical. And I think we're probably learning how to do that better. And frankly, reminding ourselves of the value of that, particularly for certain populations of students that we may have kind of taken for granted or forgotten for that matter. I know what we're hearing most from our students is how desperately they want to come back to our campus, how much they miss the social interaction with their friends, how much they miss being with their faculty and staff. And I'm not sure that they would have necessarily thought that was what experience they were going to have. And so I think there's a lot of the criticisms that we've seen that we are experiencing through this, but I think there is some value in this that will help us address some of those concerns and criticisms as well.
I'd love to connect your observation about science with Tim's observation about leadership, because it seems like at the intersection of those two ideas is the notion of expertise. And expertise is another area that's really under challenge in our country today. And this is exacerbated by the current moment and how people get their news and their information. And this is true for Christians and non-Christians. It's left and right, but we see echo chambers in all directions. And we don't even agree on what science is or what expertise is. There was a time where my position as a university law professor would give me a certain expertise on the law, but I sometimes feel on social media, it's whoever has the most Twitter followers gets the loudest voice in the room. So I'm wondering, as institutional leaders and as Christian leaders, how do you think about the importance of expertise, and how do you use your own spheres of influence to direct people who are listening to you and to your institutions to expertise and not partisan takes on the current moment?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. You know, unfortunately, I think, well, let me give you an anecdote that, as was mentioned earlier, I went to Stanford University for my undergraduate experience, and it was kind of a no-brainer for me. It was an hour away from my home. They had a great gymnastics program, and I was a gymnast. And but I had a number of people at my church who asked me, "Aren't you afraid that you're going to lose your faith?" Because I was talking about going to a secular university. And whether it's in comments like those or in across the blogosphere and social media, I think that we have seen such a cultivation of skepticism, just these knee-jerk negative reactions against academics, against scientists, against experts, and just the sense that they're kind of all motivated by a set of motives and a worldview that's somehow alien or antagonistic to Christianity. And that's not been my experience. You know, I found those years at Stanford to be enormously enriching to my faith. And as I went on to other educational institutions, one of which, Princeton Seminary, was a faith-driven institution, and then on to Harvard, which was not. These are people who've devoted their entire lives to developing a deep understanding of their subject matter area. And I found my life so much enriched by engaging with them, whether or not they shared my worldview and my faith commitments. And so I think when you see some of the kind of intrinsic antagonism or skepticism amongst the evangelical community in the United States, and the ways in which that, I think, delayed some churches or Christian communities from responding well as this came about, that's really unfortunate. And I think we're reaping the consequences of a kind of unhealthy disengagement that's gone on for too long. As for how we reverse that, I mean, this is one of those, maybe this is a teachable moment, a clarifying moment when, you know, no amount of spin was going to change the fact that we had a virus that was coming and that has come and that has spread very, very rapidly. And so I think there's some question at what I'm intrigued to know is, how are we going to look back? What are the narratives that we're going to tell about this after the fact? Are we going to say, well, the story is because the death rates weren't quite as high as we thought they were, then ergo the experts were all wrong, right? Or are we going to say, which I think is the more responsible interpretation, that because the country eventually ended up mostly listening to the experts, that we were able to keep those rates low. So a lot of the long-term impact, I think, is going to be kind of in the, how does that historical narrative get shaped? And I think my desire would be that this is an opportunity for us to point people to the very real importance of expertise, not taking it as the end-all be-all, and holding fast to all of our biblical convictions, but understanding that there is a lot that we can learn from people who've devoted their lives to these subjects.
You know, I think at universities in particular, we have a real opportunity to, with our students, to try to help them understand how to evaluate the information that they're reading and that they're seeing, and how to differentiate between real facts and information that they can trust and other information that may just be based on someone's perspective or opinion. And I think one of our responsibilities in higher education, particularly in a Christian higher education institution, is to help students believe what they believe because they believe it and they understand the grounding in it, not because somebody else told them that they should believe it, so that they really own what they believe and why they believe it. And that can be about their faith, it can be about their other, their more academic understanding, but that we challenge them to think for themselves, to understand and ground what they believe in something that's real. And so we have an opportunity to influence thousands of students over time in how they think and how they reason and how they understand what truth really is. I have a daughter that went to Rice University, so an exceptional academic institution, a secular institution. So her experience in many ways was much like Tim's. And I will tell you, people worried about her going to a secular institution. She'd gone to a Christian high school in California. And I will tell you, her faith was really strengthened there because she really had to stand up for what she believed. She had to listen to other perspectives and struggle with that and come to terms with it. And that's part of the college experience is really learning in what you believe in those difficult circumstances. And I think in a Christian environment, like we have at Baylor and many other Christian universities, you can ground that in some biblical learning as well and help people understand and think for themselves. And so hopefully the work we're doing at colleges and universities with our young people will help them over time know how to differentiate kind of real information from information that's not based in science and fact, as much as we wish it was sometimes.
It's tricky because on the one hand, we want to teach critical thinking skills. We want to teach commitment to truth and biblical values and understanding. And on the other hand, we don't want to encourage overt skepticism of everything, overt distrust. And so how you strike that balance of holding firmly to what you know and believe and what you're committing your life to, but also being open to different viewpoints and being charitable and interpreting those viewpoints. And I find, especially in the online engagement, there's not much grace and charity when trying to interpret sort of a different perspective.
Well, I think part of it's helping people know how to listen to others that believe and think differently than them and to be open to that, but then also to learn how to articulate your perspective in a way that others will listen to. And we have an environment now where we kind of talk past each other a lot and we don't talk with each other and really try to learn and understand one another. It may, even if we're not going to change our opinion, but it does give us a greater ability to articulate what we believe and to listen to what other people believe, which helps us at least know how to live and work in community together, even when we don't agree with each other. And I know the book you're working on, John, probably touches on, or that you just published probably touches on some of those things. How do we live in community even when we have differences of perspective and thinking on things?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that point, John, that I think the incentive structures, you mentioned kind of online content and online political dialogue and so forth. And really all of the incentive structures of online content kind of bend your will toward the things that are short, superficial, instantaneous, hyperbolic, that are kind of playing to the extremes. And I can give, examples of when I was first starting out at Patheos and I was doing a fair amount of blogging and writing. There were certain things that I knew if I write it like this, it's going to get picked up by, these social media personalities who already had a large following, or it's going to get picked up by certain conservative websites that are going to post the link, and that's going to drive a lot of traffic. And there were, the websites that do that today are somewhat different than what they were before, but, the gold standard was getting into Drudge, right? And so now if you wrote something that took a few days to reflect and to reflect more deeply and offers a more balanced and moderate perspective on things, then that was, number one, it was after the fact, right? Because everybody had jumped on the first 10 articles that were, or blog posts that were written about the topic. But also it wasn't picked up by those who kind of pulled the levers on the far ends of the political spectrum. And so it tended to attract much less traffic. At Christianity Today, I mean, it's helpful in that you have a built-in audience, you have a regular audience that comes to you. But I think defining those kinds of middle spaces and rewarding them, right? I mean, not doing kind of the hate clicks for points of view that are opposite of ours, or just going to those places that reinforce our own presuppositions. But going to those middle spaces that are willing to take a little bit more time to reflect, offer a more nuanced and balanced perspective, may be a part of reshaping the incentive structures of the media landscape, without which I feel like it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation that's not just hyperpolarized right from the start.
I mean, I just completely agree with what you're saying there, but I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on how actually to do it? Because our human incentive structures are to respond to the egregious and the visceral and the emotive. and the hot takes. And I mean, I look, as an academic, I have a vested interest in exactly what you said, slowing down and adding nuance to conversations. But that doesn't always get a lot of traction when people want to respond in almost a participatory way to what the news is.
Yeah, for organizations that are entirely dependent on advertising, it's extremely difficult. Your advertising will be at least partly dependent on the number of clicks that you get, right? The number of visits or visitors that you get, and how many advertising impressions you're able to feed to them. And so you have a native incentive structure that's guiding you toward the things that are going to attract the most traffic, right? You're able to begin to shift the economics if you have more of a membership approach or subscriber approach or membership approach, or if you have a more diversified revenue stream where maybe there's, as there is for us, there's some from advertising, some from subscriptions, some from product sales, some from philanthropy, and that allows you to be a little less unduly influenced by the drive to maximize traffic. And I think that's part of shifting this media landscape over the long term. That's happening already, right? People are, those organizations that are almost wholly dependent on advertising are the ones that are dying out. And that may be actually a good thing in the long run.
Another thought listening to our conversation tonight that hit me was just how challenging it is in the current moment when everybody seems to be in some sort of crisis at the same time. So I was reflecting about 4 or 5 years ago, my parents lost their house in a wildfire in Colorado Springs, and the fire came over the mountain and took out their whole neighborhood in 15 minutes. And so normally, if you have a catastrophic event, you turn to your neighbors and your friends for help. But in that case, everybody had been devastated at the exact same time, and everybody had lost everything. And there are analogies and disanalogies here, but in a lot of parts of our country right now, in a lot of institutions, everybody is shoveling water out of the boat, or the boat is already starting to sink. And so how do you respond to crisis as individual institutions, knowing that everyone else is in trouble around you? And how do you make decisions about when to help, when to look inward, when to take risks, and in a Christian vein, when to love sacrificially your neighbor, and then alternatively when to steward well your own resources?
No, it's a great question. And, I think in higher education, it's kind of interesting if you think just about the higher education community. In many ways, we actually share a lot of information and a lot of what we've done that's worked, what we've done that hasn't worked. We protect certain aspects of what we do that we might view as competitive, but in general, we share a lot. And so I think even in times like this, I'm on calls all the time with other university presidents about what they're dealing with, what they're going through, how what they're doing can help me, how what I'm doing can help them. That's not so much from a physical or monetary resource perspective, but it's really providing support and encouragement to one another. And I think, frankly, just knowing that other people are going through the same thing, and that because you don't have all the answers, like nobody has all the answers. And so there is some comfort in that, knowing that you're not the only one going through it. So I do think just kind of the moral support and encouragement we can provide each other through this is critically important. And frankly, I think Christian institutions, whether it's churches or universities or other kinds of Christian organizations, it is an opportunity for us to love our neighbors even maybe more broadly and more generously than we have before, when we were just sort of focused internally on getting things done and moving forward, with whatever we were doing. But when you see everybody suffering through the same things, I think it does sort of broaden your perspective and does give us an opportunity to minister to folks that we might not have touched or might not have come to us to have an opportunity to influence them in some way. And then I think the other thing for us as a research institution, some of the research our faculty are doing is going to be helping to solve this problem. And it may not have been research we were going to do otherwise, but research that we can take a skill set, a focus that a faculty member had, and shift it to focus on the virus to try to help find a solution. I'll just give a specific example. We've got some of our environmental scientists that do a lot of water research. and they study wastewater. Well, they're actually working on a process by which you can test for the virus in wastewater in communities, especially when we aren't doing broad-based testing or antibody testing. They think it's possible to test for the virus in wastewater in communities to know how widespread the virus actually is. So we have a better sense of whether we're getting anywhere near to some level of herd immunity. And also you can do that testing based on where in the community people live. And so you can actually then begin to see if there's certain populations in your community that are being more impacted by the virus than others, which has public policy implications. It has implications for public health issues. So I do think there are ways that we can think about what we do as organizations that we can apply to the specific issues and problems that we're dealing with now that we might not have thought about at all, that can have a really broad impact far beyond our walls and maybe different than we would have done before.
Yeah, I think, John, you kind of point to the reality, at least from kind of a market frame of mind of competition amongst different Christian organizations and institutions. And of course, that's it would be wonderful if we could tend to the proper spacing and sequencing of our crises, right? And kind of stretch them apart. In the absence of our capacity to do that, we're going to find ourselves in these sorts of situations where, of course, it always was the case that institutions of higher Christian education compete over students, right? Or over donors, and organizations like mine as well, over donors, over subscribers, over advertisers, foundation partners, and so forth. There's a certain sense in which it's always the case that there are limited resources in any one of those sorts of categories or individuals or groups. And yet that just becomes so much heightened in a situation like this. And sometimes it does feel difficult when people are dealing with such immediate physical needs, when they're losing jobs by the tens of millions, and when people are unable to afford food and so forth. It does feel difficult to kind of put your vision out there. And yet I think we all as leaders need to choose whether we are going to approach the work that we do with a scarcity mindset or an abundance mindset. And in that scarcity mindset, it is kind of a zero-sum game. But I really believe in the abundance mindset. I really believe in the abundance of God's kingdom. I believe that those organizations that are true to their calling and are pursuing those callings with integrity, that there are enough resources out there for them to flourish and to do the work that God put them on the planet to do. So I always love it when, we get to know other organizations that have a similar sort of abundance mindset, and they're not feeling so possessive of resources or relationships, but there's kind of a mindset that let's all bless one another and together we'll lift up the kingdom of God. At the end of the day, it's kind of a choice of which mindset are we going to take with us into the work that we do.
That reminds me, I was at Pepperdine before I went to GW, then back to Baylor. And I can't remember which former president of Pepperdine said this, but it was that there's no competition between lighthouses. And particularly as Christian institutions, we really are to be light in the world to others. And we need to think about that in terms of how we all support one another and work together to help others in the world and not think about it from a competitive perspective. And I love the way you described that, Tim. It's a great way to think about it.
There was a question from the audience that I'm going to jump my own cue here, and it was a follow-up to this line, which is a lot. Can we think of practical examples where we see this kind of sacrificial partnership that no longer looks zero-sum, that can look win-win, especially among Christian institutions? And I'll answer the question because I just had an example come to mind, which is I think out of the AND campaign, there's a program called Churches Helping Churches Now, where they're asking especially larger, wealthier churches to give money to help smaller, less wealthy churches, particularly and often churches of non-white membership who are struggling financially at the point of existence, not at the point of cutting programs, and is their way to reallocate money within the church and not sort of wait to see what Washington, D.C. is going to do with government resources. And to the extent that a program like that can get traction, that it can be lived out in a very tangible, concrete way, I think there's a direct financial benefit, but there's also a really powerful expressive witness of tangible sacrifice from one institution to another. Are there other examples from either of you along these lines that come to mind?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful example that you mentioned. There are a couple that come to mind. One is something called Illuminations that brings together a number of ministries that are involved in Bible translation. And rather than all of those ministries kind of pursuing their very similar goal independently, they band together and essentially kind of divide and conquer, right? And let's figure out how we can collaboratively reach our goal of providing the Bible in every person's heart language more quickly than we could do if we all just kind of, retained our institutional walls and kept the moats around them, clean from any sort of invasion. Something similar amongst Christian college fellowships called the Every Campus Initiative that is collaborative between organizations like Navigators and InterVarsity and Cru. And just, I hope it's okay to share this, I think so, but I think Gary Haugen of International Justice Mission is a great example of this. And so when I had the opportunity, we've had a series of conversations, but the very first one where I was kind of sharing what our vision is for Christianity today, he said, we have some donors that I think would love that vision, and I'd love to introduce you to them. And that doesn't happen a lot, and it certainly doesn't happen by people who are hyper protective of their own donor relationships. And I expressed my surprise, and he, waxed eloquent about how there is more than enough in God's kingdom, and God is going to make sure that the resources go to the places where they're needed.
Can you give me Gary's number offline, Tim? Linda, how about you? Any thoughts?
Well, I think that, and sort of independent of this particular crisis that we're going through, you do certainly see among Christian colleges and universities working together on issues, whether that's thinking about ways, particularly among the smaller colleges and universities, how we might share resources around online learning where we can share courses and those sorts of things, or where we can collaborate on programs or projects. Again, especially with smaller organizations, some of those things are hard to do by yourself because of the infrastructure and resource it takes. And CCCU, that's helping sponsor this, does a wonderful job of helping bring about collaboration and coordination between the Christian colleges and universities in the country to help bridge and find ways that they can work together so all are healthier and stronger, rather than them sort of being all out there on their own trying to figure out how to deal with some of these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd love to ask you both to reflect a bit on the personal dimension of this and how the personal affects your professional roles. We all are here representing certain institutional roles, and yet we're also human beings, and that's always the case, of course. But usually we would be having a discussion like this at some fancy hotel on a stage, and now I find myself on the other side of that door. My 3 kids are doing who knows what, right? And I'm pretending to be calm and collected here, but really 10 feet away could be total chaos. And so there's something a little more tangible and near about the personal dimension of this. I think it's also the case, I know I've experienced this, and a lot of people I'm talking to have as well, where there's a kind of a decision fatigue going on right now, where everything seems to take twice as long to be half as efficient. And you end the day, and we're not commuting. There are lots of things that we've sort of stripped out of our day, and yet the days feel longer and more exhausting. So I wonder if I could ask each of you to reflect both on the connection between the personal and the professional, and then also if you have examples of spiritual practices or ways in which your own Christian faith has been sustaining or helpful in the current moment.
I'm happy to jump in. So, they say that conflict develops character, but crisis defines it. And I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in that. that for a lot of us, this is an identity defining moment for us as leaders and for our institutions. It's this is the moment when the light shines the brightest, and when people, all of our various constituencies will be looking and forming their perception of who we are. And I think this is I really welcome this as an opportunity to be who we are. And for those who are listening, I think, going back to your vision and your mission statements and renewing your commitment to those things, holding fast, with an unerring conviction to the vision and mission, and yet being incredibly agile and flexible in how you pursue that in this rapidly shifting landscape is very, very important. We're all defining how people are going to perceive us. We're defining how we're going to understand ourselves. We're defining who we're going to be, not just now, but potentially for years to come. And that's really daunting. It's also really exciting. And so that applies for our institutions. It also applies for us just as people. And it's a frightening, disorienting, exhilarating time all at once, right? And all of us are juggling not just work obligations, but rapid, dramatically shifted family obligations and circumstances of life. And so I have found it, I've asked myself, who do I want to be in this moment? And one of the answers was very clearly centered in Scripture, very clearly centered in the Word. And so I've been writing a nearly daily meditation series called The Hallway Through the Sea that I've really been enjoying. And I undertook to write it, not because I expected, to build a major audience, but because it would really require me to spend time daily in God's Word and reflecting on what all of this means for us. And I've just found that incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
As I reflect on this, it has changed my way of working dramatically. I mean, in the role I'm in, I travel a lot, which I know both of you do. I go to a ton of events. I am with students all the time, faculty or staff. I do a lot of fundraising and alumni events. And so I'm very outwardly focused and very engaged with people, sometimes in large settings, sometimes in small. And so all of a sudden to shift and be in your office at home by yourself on the computer all day is a dramatic change in how I do work and the pace of my life. And there's parts of that are really difficult and challenging, and I don't really like that much. But then there are pieces of it that I think have caused me to be more reflective, probably more meditative. I actually have a lot more alone time. I was rarely alone in my previous way of doing work and living. And so I do think it has given me more opportunity to sort of step back, have quiet times in a different way, to have times of reflection and meditation in different ways than I might have before, and to be a little bit more introspective probably than I am at other times, or maybe that I'm as comfortable with in terms of how I do work and how I live. So I think that has been good for me and been important. I think that it also has made me probably value even more the way other people care for me. And, you get so busy, you don't really pay a lot of attention. But, I have a husband who's a wonderful prayer warrior, and that's always meaningful, but it's been particularly, I think, helpful and powerful in this time. I have a daughter who I told you about, went to Rice. She's actually in our seminary now at Truett Seminary. And so she's and she's hilarious. So she keeps me grounded and laughing and humble all the time, as our children oftentimes do. But then I have just a great team of people to work with and a wonderful board. And they're praying for you, they're supporting you, and that we're all focused on the same thing, and it's all driven by our mission as a Christian institution. So that, I think I've come to sort of recognize and appreciate that even more than I would have otherwise. And then the other thing I would say, I've probably read different things biblically than I would have before. As our daughter Shelby is in seminary, they've been reading the Minor Prophets in one of her classes. That is not exactly what you normally go to read, but I decided I would read some of those while she was reading them. And there's some really great leadership lessons and thoughtful work in there that frankly has been sort of comforting and inspiring. Some of them are kind of depressing too, but comforting and inspiring. And it just gives you a different perspective on kind of a biblical way of thinking about things, and sometimes where we spend most of our time as we're reading through the Bible.
The other sort of biblical book that comes to mind right now is the Psalms, and Sarah Groves, who has a chapter in the book of mine that just came out, has a beautiful reflection on how the Psalms allow us to channel our observation of both the immense beauty and wonder of God's creation in one moment, and then turn immediately to just despair at how broken and terrible things can be. And that's part of the human experience too, is holding both of those in tension at the same time. I wonder, Tim, do you have any resources or perhaps past examples that you're drawing upon at the current moment?
A colleague of mine by the name of Gail shared a quotation from Buechner that here is the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. I think that's well put. This is one of those moments when both beautiful and terrible things are happening. I want to join with Linda in praising God for a praying spouse, and just the ways in which family really keeps us rooted in moments like this. For me, I've taken a lot of inspiration over the years from the mystical and monastic traditions and more recent writers like Nouwen and Merton and so forth. But this has been a time of going back straight to the Word. So if you ask about resources for me, it's just been delving back into scriptures, including things that I've read many times before, but finding new things every time.
Before we turn to the audience questions, I have one more question for the two of you that goes back to this challenge of institutional leadership in particular. And it's the balance of, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, but as Christians, I have Christian friends who are much more of in the spirit-led realm. We're just going to be led, we're going to wake up and pray and figure out what the Spirit has to lead us. And then I have other Christian friends, and I'll probably self-disclose that I'm more in this category of, we're planners, right? We trust in the big picture. We believe this, all of it, and yet we're also going to do a lot of planning. And how do you balance sort of the willingness and the agility to wake up and be open to the leading of the Spirit and perhaps new and surprising direction on the one hand, and responsible and perhaps mundane stewardship and working within the plans and the strategic plans that you necessarily have to do within large institutions?
It's an interesting question to reflect on. And, I think part of it, when we have our leadership, the people we work with from a leadership perspective, they have different perspectives on these issues. And that's helpful because everybody doesn't come to the issues with that same, either more spirit-led perspective versus that more planful perspective. But I do think when you're in these kinds of situations where it's so uncertain and you're having to make decisions without a lot of information, I mean, in a way, blending those two perspectives is helpful because we do have to trust that God is going to help lead us through this, and that there is hope that we will get to the other side of this. And frankly, that we could actually be better and we could thrive on the other side of this in ways that we weren't before. But yet, I think God also gives us the knowledge, the skills, the giftedness to think, to plan, to reason, and that we have to do that. And He has given us those gifts, those skills, and frankly, if we're not doing scenario planning and thinking about the options that are out there and gathering the information and planning for various alternatives, we're probably not being good stewards of the giftedness that God has given us or the responsibility that He has given us to steward our organizations in good ways. And that doesn't mean that we don't trust Him or rely on Him to provide us with guidance as we go through these difficult times.
Yeah, I think Linda answered that beautifully. I believe that God is as much involved and the Spirit is as much involved in the planning and in utilizing and developing, cultivating over the years the gifts that that he then utilizes in moments like this. So I think it's important always to be open to the Spirit leading in a direction that you had not planned, but at the same time, inviting the Spirit into that planning process. But maybe I'll just take the opportunity to reflect on one other tension. And this is kind of my vision of Christian leadership, not just leading a Christian organization, but being a Christian leader, is that that being a Christian leader always has to mean being a Christ-like leader. And being a Christ-like leader is impossible apart from the cross. And there are times in our organizations when people need us not only to be kind of the bold person forging the path forward, but where they need compassion, where they need pastoral care. There are times when they need humility from us and the ability, the willingness to learn from others and learn from our own mistakes and be open about those mistakes. And I think this is one of those moments that we need to be open to learning from any source, and that we need to be open about, how this is hard. This is hard for all of us. So even as the tension there is, we want to do that, and yet we also want to bring strength and calm and peace into what we do. And so I don't think that's an either or. I think it's a both and. I think it's a productive tension that we're called to maintain as leaders of our organizations.
I'm going to turn now to some of the audience questions. I won't have time to get to all of them, unfortunately, and I will paraphrase some. So if you don't hear yours, just assume it's in one of my paraphrases. But I want to, one of the questions that came in is, can you think of strategies you're working on to re-engage with those who have not remained closely connected to your organization? I think for both of you in different ways, this is a challenge, but are there ways to use the current moment to re-engage with people who were once engaged, or perhaps people who have not yet engaged?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been trying to think of our organizational response in terms of 3 phases. 1, stabilize, analyze is the second, and then optimize is the third. And the stabilize is what President Livingstone was describing earlier of, you have to make some very quick decisions in the midst of the moment in order to make sure that the organization is able to survive, right? The analyze, I asked every member of my team to do a top to bottom review of revenue projections, of expenses, of strategies, and particularly to kind of look at where might we reposition or pivot or speak into new and emerging needs. And, as many on this who are attending this will know, we also had our own we spaced out our crises. We had one in December that overflowed into January, really around an editorial that we had published referencing President Trump. And I think that, for anybody who judged us on that one piece, that would give a really imbalanced view of who we are. And a lot of those folks right now, where we're telling the stories of how the global church is responding to coronavirus, we're developing resources that are helping churches to navigate this incredibly rapidly shifting landscape. People are getting a better picture of the fullness of what Christianity today is and does. And so I do think it's an opportunity to kind of demonstrate our value. Like I said before, be who we are, be who God made us to be. And some who may have been, not paying attention for any variety of reasons are finding themselves very much in need of a voice like ours right now.
And I do think that through this, because we're having to find different ways to engage with people and communicate, it is giving us the opportunity to engage with different sets of people and in ways we might not have engaged with before. And I've talked about the research our faculty do. We've got a lot of faculty that are experts in mental health, in how to do things in disruptive ways. We have researchers that are, as I mentioned before, in several areas looking at how we solve some of these problems. And they're having the opportunity to speak to that in ways we might not have before, whether that's in the media or with people that are dealing with public policy issues. So we're having that opportunity to make that connection. We have this great program called the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. And it's a program that's designed to help feed school-age children that don't have access to meals. And it was basically a Texas-based program focusing on feeding children in rural areas. And when this crisis occurred and students have been sent back home, a lot of times children in rural areas don't have the access to the food programs that they do in urban areas. Well, we've now partnered with the Department of Agriculture, gave us a very, very multi-million-dollar grant with McLean Group and with PepsiCo to expand that program, I think, to 3 or 4 other states. It may grow beyond that, to be able to feed children in rural areas that might not be served at this time. Well, that is expanding our touch into populations we would have never touched prior to this, and really to be able to have an impact in ways that certainly connect back to our Christian mission about having a caring community and caring for others. And then I think, we've got students all over the country now. And we've got students doing wonderful things in their communities back home or wherever they're sheltering in place that they would have been on campus in our life at Baylor and wouldn't have had that ability to touch and reach people going through this pandemic in the way that they are, because they're away from our campus and hopefully taking what they're learning here to impact their communities in hopefully socially distantly healthy ways. And then I think the other thing, as a university, we're communicating in different ways. We're doing lots more of these kinds of events where we're sharing what we're doing and experiencing on social media, where we're engaging with our prospective students, with our students' parents in social media, and frankly, touching people more regularly in these kinds of ways than we normally would be. And I think that's absolutely giving us the chance to touch people we wouldn't have. We've even done some pretty funny, crazy things on social media that frankly I would have never thought I would do as a university president, but I have done. And it's been fun, and students have appreciated it, and it's connected us in ways that we wouldn't have connected before. So there certainly is, there are ways we're connecting outside of the folks we normally would have through this, because of the opportunities it's given and how we communicate and what we're communicating about.
John, I want to add real quick that, and I want to go see some of those fun things on social media that you've done.
I did my very first TikTok with my husband.
Nice.
So it's
Did
what
you
happens
dance?
when you have a daughter that
That's right.
knows all about this social media stuff.
That's right. Well, so it is certainly the case that in the midst of the suffering of the present moment, that people are asking spiritual questions that they might otherwise have been too proud or too distracted to ask. And so we have certainly seen that. All the data bears that out. And so we are doing our best to kind of speak to those who are seeking some sort of spiritual meaning in the midst of the moment. Maybe on the other end of the spectrum, and prompted by Linda's great note, we've been using social media in some different ways to just say, hey, send us a picture of how your congregation is doing church, or what it looks like as you gather with your family to participate in a streaming service, or tell us what are some songs that are helping you get through this moment, right? Things that are allowing us to connect a little bit less with kind of the stereotypical CT reader as the educated pastor or church leader, right? And that's very important to us. We want to speak to that audience. It's also not the only audience that we want to speak to, and we want to speak to that homeschooling mother or the father who's home and engaging and trying to figure out how to survive another week with his kids nonstop. So that has been an interesting opportunity to reach some different audiences.
I have one more audience question. It's sort of a compilation of a few questions, and then I'm going to ask each of you if you want any kind of closing thoughts or final thoughts reflecting on this conversation. But for the last audience question, and it dovetails a little bit from what Linda was saying a minute ago in her answer, but I'm interested, you all both steward fairly complex and longstanding institutions, and you're not in the category of institutions that are at this point month to month, but many Christians and many people in this country now are parts of nonprofits and small businesses that in their existence, their payroll, their possibilities are are measured in terms of weeks or months, or they've already closed. And a lot of this is socioeconomically disparate. And we see also the effects of this virus hitting Black communities in particularly hard ways. And Eugene Scott and others have pointed out that these are consequences of much broader and much longer standing structural inequities. And that's not always a message that Christians are ready to hear or engage with. But I'm curious if each of you might reflect on the renewed recognition of the disparities in this country that are being revealed by this virus, by the economic crisis, and how do you in your own institutional roles think about engagement with the broader church, but also the broader country along those issues?
Well, I do think that we're learning a lot through this about public health issues and how they impact different populations so dramatically differently. And hopefully a part of that will be learning for all of us about things we can do both in our institutions and in influencing public policy in other areas that will bring more equity to some of these really important issues. And certainly as an educational institution, we have the opportunity to educate our students about it. We have a public health department that works on these issues regularly and all the time. But I do think it also calls us to probably engage more outside our walls on these issues all the time, and not just, when we have a crisis or that we're having to deal with. How do we think about as an institution that we sort of serve the least of these, as Jesus calls us to do? And sometimes those folks are on our campuses and part of our communities, and sometimes they're outside the walls of our campus. We have a project called in Waco. We have some really underserved areas and some underserved schools that really struggle. And we have a program, Solid Gold Neighborhood is what we call it, about how do we engage in the community outside the walls of Baylor to help make our community better, to help increase the economic opportunities for people, to increase the educational outcomes for those in our community, to help reduce the health disparities in our community. And so I think this just accentuates why that's important. And it's really a calling to us as Christians to look at how we can do that better and more significantly as we go through this and as we come out on the other side.
Yeah, I think Linda put it well, and you put it well, John. That it's not only in health outcomes and certain kind of persistent health inequities, inequalities, but a lot of churches that are African American churches or Hispanic American churches weren't necessarily as poised for a move to digital. And so that has been more devastating for a lot of those kind of congregations, especially smaller congregations, storefront congregations, et cetera, that are just not, they weren't able to flip a switch and stream everything and move all of their donations online and have abundant ways of connecting. Sometimes that's because of their own technological capacities. Other times it's because of the people that they serve. And so that move has been, I'd say, disparately devastating, right? There are some congregations that have made that switch very easily and have actually seen increased giving, right? There are others that are down 50% because they're not meeting and they really don't have mechanisms. So there are certain inequities that I think you raise that kind of the effects of long-term neglect and disparities that are leading to disparate fatality rates and so forth. But it also applies in the church. And so that's just an area where I think we need continued education. And CT, I mean, we would love to be a part. I haven't seen this yet. If anybody knows that something along these lines are out there, but we'd love to be a part of helping to fashion a sort of clearinghouse for, I'm a Christian, I want to engage, I don't know how. And I could do something that's geographically based. I could do something that's a little bit more focused in an area that I have expertise or particular passion about. But how could we create something that helps connect all the people who want to help with all the people who need help? and does that at scale. That's something that we would love to be a part of. So if anyone out there wants to partner, then you let me know.
It's a great invitation. I hope people will take you up on that. We are coming to a close here, and I'd love, as the last question, just to invite each of you to reflect on anything you have about this conversation or other final thoughts you want to share with the people listening in. Linda, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, one, I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been great to get to be with John and Tim. I did not know them before this, and it's been wonderful to be a part of this conversation with you. But I think I would end with just a sense that, I really think we should have a sense of hope as we go through this. I think that as difficult as it is, as challenging as it is, I think as Christians, we know that, our hope is not in the worldly things we're dealing with. Our hope is in Christ, and it's eternal hope. And we have the opportunity through this to share that hope with others and to be a light in the world in a way that the world really needs it right now. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us as Christians and Christian institutions to really have an impact in even more significant ways than maybe we were having before.
Yeah, maybe building on that theme and touching on your point, John, that there are a lot of organizations that are facing severe existential challenges right now, and people who are trying to figure out, do I need to cut, these employees whom I love and who rely upon their paycheck to provide for their families, or is my business going to go under, or is my nonprofit going to go under, and what's going to happen to me and to my family in the midst of all of that? And I have a deep sympathy for that as someone who started a business and helped to lead a small business for 6 years before coming here, still connected to it, a creative agency called Polymath. But it's, so I get it. Those are, gosh, anxious times. And it's hard to wrestle with those sorts of things. I would underscore what Linda just said about hope, that the same God who holds us now, he's held us all the way through and has demonstrated faithfulness to us time and time and time again. And we have no reason to expect otherwise. And I would also say to be more forward looking than backward looking. And I think a lot of people are asking, when do we return to normal, right? I don't think there is a return to the old normal. I think there's a kind of stepping into a new normal. We don't know just how long and how deep this winter is going to be, but we know that there will be spring on the other side, and it may look different from what we had thought. But that's an incredible opportunity to embrace. I mean, I think that the organizations that are slowest to adapt to the changing climate are the ones that are going to fall by the wayside. And I think if we're open to wherever God may be leading us and looking to be creative, looking to find ways of connecting our mission with this moment, then we'll be among those who are, Lord willing, able to endure and to flourish and even to grow in that new climate.
Well, I will add my third vote for hope here, and a reminder that it's hope in whom we trust as much as anything else. And Linda and Tim, I just want to thank you for being part of this conversation. It's been the best Zoom event I've had in the 3,000 of the last week. And I want to thank our sponsors, Baylor University, Christianity Today, and the CCCU. I want to remind Gary Haugen to give me a call, and wish you all a good night. Thanks for joining us, and be well. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.